for 60 by 60.
Because I don't have the option to graduate.
Small.
All right, we are gonna get started.
I think we have like about,
We're gonna get started, we're gonna get through this, and we're gonna get on to some hopefully higher, more in-depth analysis and some more relevant analysis to the immediate creation of games next quarter. So we're still in the process of going through all of the elemental tetrad elements for each of the three layers. We're in the middle layer, the dynamic layer, between the inscribed layer and the cultural layer. We'll talk about narrative briefly, and there's not too much left of all of this. We're down to the last 7 or 8 slides, so we're most of the way through it. And we'll start talking about how to be thinking about the design process. What is it like to actually think through, what do I want to make a game about, and how do I bring that idea to life? So a dynamic narrative is narrative that is created. It's not prescribed by the game itself, but it's created through playing the game. So it may be a kind of narrative that the developers intended, yet it's not something that was hard-coded. It's something that was dynamically generated by a player. 2 different types. You could have something like an interactive fiction. This is someone could write a story about the process of the game being played, which would come to life at the dynamic layer about the choices that you make inside of the gameplay. Then there is the one that I've been talking about, the emergent narrative, which is when someone talks about the experience playing the game or is playing the game in real time and streaming. So you're watching someone else play the game. You are creating a dynamic narrative of a particular playthrough of the game that's not scripted by the game, but is interpreted through the use of playing the game. There's not too much more to the dynamic narrative than just those 2 different ways to do that. A story made by someone who's played the game about the game, or the narrative of someone playing the game. Technology. So what is happening when the prescribed technology is working in a particular instance of the game? So the in-game behavior of all of the randomizers, of all of the rules as they come to life, what is it like to engage with that? So board game technology, you can look at any differences between theoretical probability and the actual outcome that you are experiencing. This is a small sample deviation from maybe what the developers had planned, but now it creates more of that emergent behavior. How am I going to do well at this game, given that the RNG gods are currently very angry at me? So some certain game situation, a 6 is just straight up rarely roll from a bunch of 2d6 rolls, even though the probability states that the outcome should happen fairly frequently. This could be something like if you're playing Catan and you have set up a very nice resource generator, a 6 is close to a 7, you expect that to be one of the most likely outcomes. Now you actually play through the game and we're never landing on this 6. The resource that is supposed to generate a lot for you is not generating to that extent. Now, what are you going to do? How will you adapt your strategy on the fly to still attempt to win the game because of this difference between the anticipated probability and the actual probability, starving you of resources? In digital games, the actual execution of the code, this could be seen as something like, how does that code work on your particular machine? So maybe, for instance, your graphics card is not good enough to run this game at 60 frames per second. Now it's running at closer to 30 frames per second. What is the actual difference between how you go about playing the game with that? If you play an online game, what happens if your connection is not stable? You're occasionally rubber banding. You're occasionally now having a delay between the input that you press and the actual reaction of the server. How does that affect how you play the game? The dynamic behavior that is generated because the technology of this particular session is working differently from either how it was expected or Maybe it's still expected to be played that way. Maybe there is a mode, a predictive mode that starts to make decisions for you. If you're familiar with predictive mode networking, something that would say it's more likely that since there is a monster on the screen, the player is going to move toward the monster or attack toward the monster. So the server can start making some calculations about if the player decides to do this, what is the outcome of this? So I don't have to decide it right on the fly. And that way it seems like it's happening faster from the user's perspective because of that bottleneck networking. Any way that that affects the player or the player's decision-making would be coming through in the dynamic layer. So anything, strategies developed by technology, more hard-coded, any strategy that the AI is currently using to react to what you have done. Yeah, any of the execution of any game code on particular hardware in a particular play session. What operating system you're using. Maybe there are more optimizations for a particular operating system, so those who are on a particular operating system have a slightly different experience. All of that is emergent dynamic layer technology. Questions on anything from a dynamic layer?
So would this include like thinking that would get harder if you were really doing well at it? Like it would adjust for your difficulty?
That would be inscribed in terms of that change, but a particular play session. So how does the player react to that difficulty increasing? That could be something in the dynamic layer.
Could you give an example of that AI at that first?
Yeah, the strategies developed by the AI. So let's say I code an AI to react to at a particular checkpoint in an RTS. I'll go back to an RTS. It's pretty easy to tell in a real-time strategy how the AI is interacting, or it's one of the major use cases for it. At the 10-minute mark, the AI's code says, all right, I'm going to determine if the player has 5,000 or more gold. If it does, then I'm going to change my AI to be more aggressive. If they have less than 5,000 gold, I'm going to change my AI to be less aggressive. And that's just an adaptive difficulty decision embedded in the AI to determine, is this a good player that needs challenge, or is this a poorer player, someone who's still learning the mechanics and might need a little bit of a handhold to make this session more approachable. That decision vastly changes the experience of the player playing the game. So it's inscribed that this decision is going to happen, but it's dynamic, whatever happens in a particular play session. So now, if a newer player has exactly 5,001 gold, exactly how this game is going to play out is going to be, it treats you like you're more experienced than you are. So you'd have a small sample deviation from what you would expect just because of that exact inscribed point. So the rules themselves are inscribed, but how those rules affect an individual play session is dynamic. Further questions? Any other clarifications? All right, let's talk about the cultural layer. This one is the briefest. It's something that you need to think about as a designer, but not really to the same level as the inscribed or dynamic. But this is thinking about beyond the game and the playing of the game, how does the fact that the game exists affect culture as a whole? So after you play the game, or after someone plays the game, does it affect other players? Does the game affect society in some way, shape, or form? So thinking about how games have shaped you, if you can make some connection to a game that you have played and how that has modified your perception of anything around you, that is everything that is operating at the cultural layer of game design. You can also think about how you individually have changed games. Have you posted anything on a message board that the developers have seen, that other players have seen, that have become more noise that makes the cultural surrounding of a particular game mechanic? We want this change, developers. Maybe they do it, maybe they don't. I have a couple instances of times that I have posted on message boards that have actually changed the outcome of how a game works. And that's cool when you have developers who actually pay attention to what the players want and listen and have an avenue for that. I made a feature request on a more indie developed game, and that got implemented within a couple of weeks. And I thought that was really cool for a particular use case of how I was playing the game, which was different from how the developers had anticipated that I was going to play the game. But that feature led to a lot more realism in the end result. So that's cool. So all aspects of the game that exist beyond that game being played. Also, you can think of it as the intersection between the community and the developers, or the community of this game and society in general. Both of those are a cultural layer interaction. So both, how does the game affect society, and how does society affect the game? One thing to note, it's interesting to think that players have more agency than developers in this sense. Developers absolutely need to be aware of the cultural implications of their work, but the players don't really need to be aware of the cultural implication of actually playing the game, or how they play a game, or how they chat about how they play the game. All of that is beyond the scope of what the developers are responsible for. But you're going to get a lot of pushback if that becomes what your game is known for. At the cultural level, it becomes a little bit blurry. It's hard to place things exactly in the tetrad. So some of these things could belong in other elements of the tetrad, which means that I also don't care as much exactly where you put it. It goes in the cultural layer. That part is usually pretty straightforward. So for mechanics, cultural mechanics, when players do something that changes the game in its inscribed state, then the culture is having an effect. So mods, we talked about how making a mod to change the effect of a game could be somewhat dynamic. Based on how you play the game, you come up with the rules you want to change and you go make those changes. But it's cultural when other players now can play a mod that you have developed. So the game affected you, you affected the game in return, and other players' ability to play the game the way that you wanted to play the game, which is why you made the mod. So some examples, Dota was born from Warcraft 3. Anything in Skyrim's creation kit, you can create a ton in Skyrim's creation kit, and the users community has done a ton with it. You could make custom game levels, and you could make an entire game surrounding the concept of the community making game levels. Games have tried that before. So this is one way that the game can affect society, is allow you to make levels in the game. So this is also common, especially in first-person shooters. Little Big Planet was the one who really pioneered the concept of the game is now the levels that the community creates. Basic story exists with some handcrafted levels, but they put a ton of effort and energy into allowing the users to fully develop their own levels. And that became the longevity of the game.
People have started recreating Call of Duty maps in Fortnite.
Yeah, that exactly as well. So house rules were dynamic mechanics because they're using and modifying the existing rules as opposed to trying to change an actual outcome that affects other players. The house rules are made for the game that is being played right here, right now, with the people who are immediately around me for this particular play session. That's why it's dynamic. Mods change the game code or change how the game works and is meant to be played by other people other than just who are right in front of you, which is why it is cultural. It affects those who are around you, not attached to the same game session. We can also think about how a game affects your everyday life. Some examples, if you actually lose friends, if you play Risk with them. There are some of those kinds of games where people get very competitive and it can actually affect things. Being aware of your environment after playing an FPS. Any FPS players who, after you've played a few hours of an FPS, you transition suddenly to real life. And you start to be more aware of your surroundings because you're very used to needing to pay attention to what are the sounds that are around me. I'm acutely aware of where that is coming from. If that transitions into your real life after you've played that, then it's a cultural level of the FPS was training you to do that, which is interesting. Anyone experience that after playing an FPS? You're more engaged
It's
and
worse
aware.
when I do it in VR.
Yeah,
The VR FPS game, and it's so much worse.
yeah. If you play a stealth game and you're worried about sneaking around and being seen or aware, if you transition very quickly into real life, you may find yourself trying to be stealthy, especially with your cat. I am not speaking from experience. After you play Assassin's Creed, you start driving around and realizing, well, that building would be pretty fun to climb and jump off of. That building would be pretty fun to climb and jump off of.
What was that?
Yeah, as long as there's a hay bale down below, and please don't do this. I'm not suggesting that you do. But if you happen to experience it in your head, that's a cultural effect. Aesthetics, you can have the community making their own art. So any art that players make, either to replace existing art or to supplement it. Fan art, art that's meant to stand alone outside of the game. Gameplay itself can be art, so things like speed running or trying to beat a game as quickly as possible, figure out what glitches can be found and abused to minimize times for this is also art, so it can be lumped in with cultural aesthetics. You can think of game designers kind of like instrument crafters, someone who's creating something that is to be played and then letting the people optimize for whatever it is, however it is that you want to use this tool or this instrument. That now exists for your creative goals, whatever your objectives happen to be, creating those additional objectives for people. As far as cultural narrative, this is the actual publishing of your own story. So if you are going to stream the game being played for other people, now this isn't your interpretation of someone else streaming the game. This is your ability to dissect the game's components without actually yourself playing the game, by watching someone else play the game or by streaming it yourself for other people to interpret. You can think of also narrative game mods if you're going to mod the game's story. So for instance, you could change Link to being referred to as a she rather than a he if you want to empower your daughter and say these heroes aren't just men all the time. Now we're going to refer to this particular hero as a she for additional representation.
Isn't Wind Waker only on the Sega Dreamcast?
I think it actually came out on the GameCube as
Wind
well.
Waker was
There's a
GameCube.
port for the GameCube as well, yeah. So any quest that you make, stories that you make, or any CRPG that has quite a bit of exploration, so something like Fallout 3 or Skyrim. And if you use a game engine to tell their own story, that could be something that is interesting. So the Red versus Blue shot inside Halo, you actually make content within the game that is not based on the game, but you can now create a story out of a game that has been created and then have episodes of that show streamed inside of that game engine. So that is another part of the cultural layer. Story told by people or stories told by news about games and about gameplay. So you can start to affect society's view of games by how that is done. So this is going to take a little bit of an interesting turn. So we've all heard the argument before that if someone who commits some kind of school shooting plays games, that has been turned in the media to say maybe games caused this, or this person is violent or learned to be violent through playing games. Nothing has really shown There's not a ton of evidence that that is true on a larger basis, but it's still an open question that could be asked. What role do games play in inciting real life violence? That is something, a cultural question that can be asked about games and how games are played. So to what extent does game addiction or the violence that is depicted in games play a role in aspects of society? You can start to affect people whether you play games or not by starting to be concerned. Does this have an effect? You can also talk about how games can be more inspirational. So this woman was losing her father to, I believe it was cancer. And if you know you have some amount of time left playing a game that is about life ending and the meaning of life, the purpose of life, what have you done, that could be used to start to come to terms with the fact that you have a limited amount of time left on the planet. So you can start making really interesting connections and using games and the fact that it is that interactive of a media outlet to really make a cultural difference to individuals dealing with their own problems. Lots of interesting ways that games can affect culture. And again, as designers, we need to be aware of and think about what are we trying to create? Are we actually creating what we want to create? How are other people going to interpret what we are creating? Is that ethical? Is that what I really want to be doing? Is that what I want this game to be known for? There's a lot of power there. So we'll end it with a little bit of discussion, but we've talked about how games can be used to be influential or to tell stories. But as designers, what are the decisions that we can make? How can we affect how people talk about the games that we make?
Listen to our players that are in the community around our game and not implement changes that they actively hate.
Nah, more microtransactions. $5 course on reveals. Good for you.
Any other thoughts?
Don't be Activision.
Don't be Activision.
Or Ubisoft, but I don't want.
What is it about what they do that is frustrating from an end user's perspective?
It's corporate.
Yeah, feeling corporate?
A lot of lawsuits come out of their offices.
Yes.
That's something Microsoft's been doing over the past couple of years is they'll buy these smaller studios that were successful, and then once they aren't hitting that extremely high goal, then they just drop them and say, well, that sucks, and all your IPs are ours still, so.
Yeah, the purchase is for the intellectual property and for the fan base who recognize the quality of that game. If ownership transfers, it's surprising the number of players who are not aware of this. And they can make a purchase decision based off of, oh, this is a sequel to a game I really liked, without realizing none of the original developers are working on this anymore. It's been bought up by a large company who just wants to milk the IP for what they can get out of it, as opposed to actually making a solid game.
Classic Theseus is ship.
Right.
It's not the same ship if it's not the same crew.
So we're doing a lot of thinking about what currently exists and what we want to avoid. What are the decisions as a designer? When we're sitting down to make a game, what can we be thinking about as we brainstorm what we want to do, to think about how will society react to this game? How will players be playing the game? Is the main audience the people playing the game, or is the main audience the people watching someone else play the game? You want to design a large-scale MMO for only the top 1% of players. Now, rather than actively playing the game, I can boot up my favorite streamer who plays this full-time for a living. Since I only have at most a couple hours a day that I can possibly put into this, how am I ever going to be competitive with people who do this for full-time? Maybe it makes more sense for me to watch someone play the game and root for them with the time that I have, rather than try to jump into it and experience it because it is so multiplayer oriented.
It's like League of Legends esports. And like one of my bosses at work actually, like he likes League of Legends, but he works like 13 hours a day, so he doesn't have time to play it. So he keeps up
Right.
with the esports and watches it, and that's how he gets the enjoyment out of it.
I think we're moving societally in a direction where there is more and more and more demand for people watching other people play games and not necessarily marketing toward the people who are playing those games. I'm just waiting for there to be a middleman. Whenever there's a sub to anyone, anywhere, they're gonna take a cut of that. It seems like a market that hasn't really developed, but I really don't want it to.
It's the natural evolution of honey.
Yeah. But it's interesting to think that you could design for that in advance, or you could design against that and then advertise. We don't do that.
And it's also kind of interesting that you brought that up because like when I was a kid, I'd be watching YouTube and watching people like play games, and my brother would ask me like, why don't I just play the games instead of watching people? But then I'm like, well, why do our parents watch football instead of go and play football?
Yeah.
Biggest argument I had about as a kid is I have no money. I'm like 9 years old.
Are you gonna buy me it or are you?
Do you have $60 to give me and a new nice PS4 so I can play this? No, you don't? Okay, then I'm gonna watch someone.
Right.
You don't have a grand to give me so I can and both buy and play Skyrim on a decent PC.
Yeah. It's an important part of the design process. Who is your audience? How are you going to monetize that audience?
So in that case, like with the watching versus playing, if someone wants to experience the story but has, you know, maybe some physical disabilities. That prevent them from having good yeah, mobility and dexterity. I mean, there are adaptive controllers that can hopefully help with that, but depending on a person's situation.
Yeah, it can absolutely be for accessibility, right? You design something for who's playing it, but then you think about who wants to play it and has some limitation and can't play it. That could be time, but that could also be something that is physical or mental, or we don't know. We can still add accessibility features to the game through the cultural application of the game. I like it. Any other questions or thoughts? We will discover just how much power we have. We have full power as the designer for what we can do. So making and thinking about those early in the design means that your game's going to be better for it. All right, we reached the end of this. We're going to move on to the next. We're going to call this acting like a designer. So we're going to start getting some experience with, all right, what does it look like to design a game? What does that process look like? I'm going to try to tie that into the software engineering process to talk about how is this similar and how is this different? Because you are developing software if you're making a digital game. So what is it like to go through this process? So we could start with a quote: game design is 1% inspiration and 99% iteration. I think we've experienced that in a software engineering class, right? You can be told what you need to do. You spend about 1% of your time thinking about how am I going to do it? And you spend about 99% of your time trying, failing, reworking, trying it again. There's a good part for design, but design is one of the steps that we're actually going to go into. So the first stage of iterative design, we're going to call analysis. This is part of the design. We need to figure out, okay, where are we? What do we have? And what is it that we want to accomplish? In a short period of time, what can we actually do to move ourselves from where we are to what we want to accomplish? You have to think about, what are your available resources? How many people do you have? How much time do you have? What is the technical experience level? When do we need to ship an end product? So for something like this class, next quarter, you're going to have 4 weeks of development in teams of size 3. That is not a ton of time, and that is not a huge development team. So you're not going to be able to produce everything you've ever hoped and dreamed of within those 4 weeks. So analysis, the step will be to say, all right, maybe in that first week, what can I do to maximize the productivity of the next 3 weeks? What can I do to get myself closer to having an end product? But also, how can I help the next 3 weeks that I have to work on be more productive? Small, short projects like this that we're going to be working on, the number one way that this is not going to work is if you try to do something that is too much, that cannot actually be completed within 4 weeks. What is actually possible to be done in 4 weeks will be less than you think can be done in 4 weeks. So you want some type of project or plan that is scalable. The first iteration you're going to do is going to be to create the either minimum viable product, a prototype of the game, something that you start to create the ability to interact with the world where most of those actions are going to do nothing. Most of those actions are going to be either boring or not fully fleshed out, but you have a system in place for that future development. So you want to be able to, over the first couple iterations, produce something that is a limited and fun experience, kind of the concept of a minimum viable product. You have a game, it's kind of fun to play, and it doesn't expand much beyond that initial premise. And then the rest of those iterations are going to be to add as much as you can to that. Flesh out the actual gameplay to make it more interesting, flesh out the length of the game so there continues to be more to do, more meaningful decisions as there is a future to apply those decisions to, and you'll just slowly iteratively work from there to improve, both lengthen and change the scope of what it's like to interact with that. So that all starts with the analysis phase, thinking about the design. What is it that we're going to accomplish as we go through this process? There are going to be 4 components, one in each of these quadrants. We're just going to continue to iterate and iterate a few times until we reach our deadline. Whatever the deadline is, that's when we ship what we have. But what we have is never too far from something that is playable, something that is deployable where people can have fun with it. The worst case scenario is you're in the middle of developing something that is so big and you're not close to a product that actually works, that someone can actually play. So you should always keep in mind how far away are you from something that is playable. So from analysis, we go to design. After we've analyzed, we're capable of figuring out, okay, how do we actually implement this? What are we going to be using? What are our structures? What are our algorithms? So given that we are here, we want to be there, how do we get from here to there? You start by brainstorming. And ends with, all right, now we have an implementation plan. We've designed this to the point where we know what we need to do in a high level of technical detail, so it is time to go do those things. So how do we actually go do that design? What tools do we use? We move on to implementation as the third. Once we have that plan, we're actually going to go execute it. I talked about this a lot, those of you who took software engineering from me. If you have a solid plan, the implementation is really easy. If you have a terrible plan, the implementation is incredibly difficult. It is worth the time that you spend in the design phase, making sure that, especially if you're in a team, everybody is on the same page. Everyone knows what everyone is doing. Everyone knows what the final product is going to look like. Everyone knows what their responsibilities are within the scope of moving from where we are to where we need to be. The where we need to be for every single one of these needs to be some kind of game prototype. It needs to be something that is playable, something that is interactable, even if the mechanics don't do anything. So if we haven't implemented health yet, great, I can run around a level and I can shoot projectiles. I can't die yet, hasn't been implemented, but I can at least see my character in a basic game world. Doesn't mean that it has to be textured or anything. Maybe it's a blank cube and you're walking around inside a blank cube, but you can still move, you can shoot a projectile, you can't die, enemies can't die. You can collide with the walls and maybe there are some bugs associated with that, but it's playable. You can sit down, you know what bugs exist, but you can interact in your environment. At the end of every week in the second part of this course, I will be checking in with your team during one of our class periods. We'll be meeting only twice a week for 2.5 hours. And in one of those, it's going to be a work day where I will meet individually with each group. And I want there to be a prototype, something that you can sit down and show me saying, this is the game as it exists right now. I don't expect every feature to be fully done, but I expect that there is a published version in alpha way before anything fully works and something that I can see and engage with. You can also think about it in terms of a graph. What is the shortest path to something that is playable or testable? Because games aren't something that you can sit and look at the code and figure out how fun is this going to be. You actually need to be playing it to figure out what it feels like to play your game. So here we have analysis to design to implementation. And finally, we need to test. So testing involves people actually playing your game. Unlike with other software, it's not just a matter of, did I implement everything that I wanted to implement? You have additional questions. Is this fun? Is a subjective question that is going to change between your players' preferences. So you need to get a sense, not just yours or the developers. You know what you're trying to implement. You know what the future is going to hold for your game. Your testers may not. So they're able to say something like, this does not feel fleshed out. You may have a plan for that, but maybe you don't. And now it becomes a priority because one of your players actually reached out to you and says, I don't like this. This isn't implemented. I expect to be able to do this. You can now start to, as you start planning for the next iteration, you can start to incorporate their feedback into your plan, given the time constraints that you know you have. There will be no way to do everything that you want to do in that shorter period of time. And I think that's true of every game that's ever been made. Regardless of when that ship date is, there's a lot that doesn't get done ahead of when the game is released. You just have to release it eventually. So always having something that's close to it, you can take that feedback, incorporate that feedback into the design, release a new version. So in preparation for the next iteration, you start to analyze the results of your game testing. Given the data that we have now, this is the next analysis step. Given this new information, how does this change what we want to be focusing on for this next iteration? What now? How much time do we have before we need the next release? What can we reasonably expect to get done? Let's go do it. So analyze results, modify your design, implement the modifications, and test again. And it's just an iterative process until you are happy enough to release it or you run out of time or resources. So the full iterative design looks something like this. In even more detail, when you analyze, think about who are we designing this game for? It's not yourself. A lot of people go into game design because they want to make fun games for themselves. Even if the target demographic is you, you still have a lot of work to do to figure out what players are closest to my preferences that I'm trying to cater to. What can I do to help them have fun? Who is this? So you need to collect some demographic information. Who do you expect to want to play your game? Where are you going to be releasing this? Should you have Mac support, Linux support, phone support? Analysis needs to keep in mind those resources. So how many team members, how much money do you have? In general, we won't have money for this class, but eventually you will have a budget if you're making a game. What is the timeline? Time is, of course, the most important resource. Once we start making games, time will be the resource. Time before it is due. So you can ask questions like, what prior art exists? In this class, you will only ever have access to what everyone in the class deems is an appropriate set of assets to have access to. So if someone comes and says, I have some paid assets, unless they're willing to make those assets free for the rest of the class, you will not be able to use them. Only free assets or only assets that everyone is going to have access to. I would like to talk to the design department and see if we can get them to make some assets. If you make your own assets, that's also okay. Not everybody has to have access to what you personally create. And that is that's going to take some of the time. That is a resource that you put into your game. And you may choose to do that and not share it. You also have to think about other games in the space. If you're trying to make something that is a knockoff of Elden Ring, it is unlikely in 4 weeks that you're going to be able to make the next Elden Ring with 3 people.
Not bad attitude.
So keeping in mind, there are really good games in this space that you're going to be in competition for players' attention, for players' money. If someone wants the Elden Ring experience, people are going to go play or buy Elden Ring. If you market it to be significantly cheaper, or if you market it to be significantly different, now you have a different demographic of someone who might be interested in your game. But if you're directly competing with another game immediately in that same design space, that is a risk. Break yourself out of that or find some way. People are done with Elden Ring. If they want the next thing, they could wait for a sequel, or they could play my game. Maybe it's not quite as good, but it gives them something to do to pass the time. In your analysis, also fastest path to a playable and testable game, because that's, again, super important here. How can we get something up and running for testing? Thinking about your mechanics are very important before you actually go do them. Is it the right call to make movement WASD? Is that really the right call? You're going to go implement that eventually, but you might want to analyze that, especially with respect to your target demographic, to make sure that the mechanics design is actually working with all of that in mind. Design is a lot of critical listening. You need to listen to your players, anyone who might become someone who is an eventual client for you. So when you design the game, obviously you want to be thinking about their experience. When you get feedback, don't just immediately throw it away. Oh, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. I know what I'm designing and it's going to be fun for me and it's going to be fun for them, even if they don't like it right now. That kind of thought process is going to have you making a subpar game. So listen to those who are playing your game. Worst case, it's a data point that you do eventually throw out because you heard from 20 people and this was the only time it came up. Treat all feedback like that, like data. There is nothing more important than data. Listen to people, try to take notes on or have a recording of exactly what they said and what they meant so that you can take that into consideration. Your team. It's very important when you're working with other people to keep them happy. Make sure that they continue to want to develop what it is that you're developing. So you should be listening to them. What do they want? They should be taking as much ownership over this product as you are. If they disagree with you, rather than immediately defaulting to arguing with them, try to understand their perspective. Try to understand their point. Why are they disagreeing with you? If you have an issue with why they disagree with you, then you can have a constructive conversation about why you see that differently. But start there. Start by understanding their perspective and having a discussion surrounding their perspective, not just getting in an argument and trying to push your preferences through. You can learn a lot by talking to people and understanding how people view the world differently or how people view this game you're working on together differently. If you have a client, if there's someone paying you to make something for them, then you should certainly be listening to them. If they want something particular out of this, they are the single most important person. You should be making sure that you are implementing exactly what they want. You want them to keep paying you and not pull the plug and go pay somebody else. And once you make this for them, you want them to come back to you and want you to make the next thing for them. Listening to your game sounds a little bit strange, but what does that mean? There are some wonderful ideas out there that just don't fit within your game. You would have to move and change your game too much to accommodate that brilliant idea. Maybe it belongs in a game somewhere. Maybe it belongs in your next game, but if it doesn't belong in this current game, don't try to force that. You should still certainly write it down and have it in a bank of ideas for something you eventually want to go do. Talked about how important it is to listen. One of those is to yourself. So your gut feeling is there for a reason. Maybe there's some really good idea there that hasn't been fully fleshed out. Rather than letting someone walk all over you and dismiss your idea, have that idea of, I think this is a really good idea. I just need to flesh it out more before I present it back to people so that they can understand the full depth of the genius of my idea. And most importantly of all, prioritize your health. I say this all the time with regards to physical health. This also is incredibly important to your mental health. You're in this for the long haul. As upperclassmen, you probably know this by now. But it's not just about meeting the next deadline, thinking about as short as these games can feel. It's important to keep yourself in a position where you can continue to stay healthy, continue to not burn out, contribute over the long haul. Make sure that you're taking breaks, make sure that you're getting sleep, make sure that you're eating well. All of these things, if you don't take care of yourself, can spiral and make it especially difficult to make a game when there are only 3 people in your group. Other people are relying on you, you're relying on yourself. So of course, it makes sense to take the best care of yourself that you can. You can also be careful of your communication. Even if it's not what you intend, if everyone around you is seeing you as someone who is too aggressive or too pushy or too, even if it's not what you mean, how it is interpreted is what matters. That is what people are interfacing with when they interface with you. So be careful with how that sounds. For implementation, we said that we want to get to testing as quickly as possible. We don't want to be stuck in implementation very long. So we want to make sure that the analysis and design are leading us to where we minimize that time of implementation. And we just want to get to something that is playable. We'll talk about this very soon, probably within the next week. You don't immediately have to sit in front of a computer. You can design a mock game that represents the game that you are trying to create digitally, get some understanding of how that game works, and make some design decisions before you start writing a single line of code. So know the power of a digital prototype, know when you are ready to transition to turning this into a digital game. So we will go over and have an entire lecture on paper prototyping. But you could make a paper prototype of a menu system, for instance, and you could even put this on paper and put it in front of someone. Here is the option menu. As quickly as you can, go identify where to change the volume. And you can actually start a timer and see for someone who has not had any time developing your game, how long does it take them? I want to click on that, go find that menu. All right, I want to click on that, go find that menu. Is your menu layout intuitive? You haven't written a single line of code about your menu, but now you already have an idea of what are people doing? How are they interacting with this menu? This thing that everyone's trying to get at is actually 3 layers deep. That doesn't make a ton of sense. When you make digital prototypes, focus on those mechanics. You can't test those any other way. So you want to make sure that those are inherent in your prototype so that you can get feedback on those mechanics. Of course, as you move on from your prototype, you're going to replace everything that you've done with that prototype with the actual implementation. But as I discuss a lot in software engineering, that prototype saves you a ton of time, even if you throw away most to all of that actual implementation. The fact that you now have experience with that design helps you to be able to implement it faster, better, to better effect. I want to quickly get through testing. So I might keep you 1 minute. I do apologize. You don't know everything about your game until someone else plays it. Not only you play it, but someone else plays it. Recognizing your own bias is incredibly important. What you like, what you don't like, what you're looking for, how you engage in a game setting, all of that is different from how someone else will. So you know what you want it to feel like, and you know what it feels like to you if you've had a chance to play it. But you've had practice with the controls, you've had practice with the mechanics, you designed it in the first place because you like that kind of game. What does it feel like to someone who's never played that kind of game before? Are your controls, do they make sense? People, when they play your game, also recognize you designed this. I don't want to hurt your feelings. You put a ton of effort into this. It works. I had fun with that. You have to be very careful of people trying to hurt your feelings. If people hurt your feelings while you're developing a game, that's great. They're being real with you. So you want to make sure that you allow for constructive criticism. My game has a flaw. Can you help me find it? I can't quite pinpoint what's wrong with this, but I think something's wrong. Can you help me identify what that is? You're opening the door for that constructive criticism. When you do get that criticism, make sure you take good notes about what it is. Your memory is very flawed. So where did the comment happen? What did the playtester say? What did the playtester mean? How severe is the issue? What can we do about that? How can we bake that into the next level of that? So we're going to hop into this again tomorrow. I have a brainstorming task for us to do tomorrow. And we'll actually be voting eventually on some of these ideas coming from a brainstorming game. So we'll play that tomorrow.